I was a lieutenant in a ladder company in the Chelsea section of Manhattan, kind of between the Trade Center and, say, Midtown Manhattan. Ladder companies are the group of firefighters that focus a lot on search and rescue. The engine companies are the people who put water on fires and also do emergency medical. But the ladder companies, get you out of a stuck elevator, deal with you when you're in a car accident, break down the doors, that kind of stuff. On 9/11/2001, I was an officer, but I was off duty. And I was at my apartment in Brooklyn when at 9 o'clock in the morning, I get a phone call from Kentucky. And this friend says, turn on your television. At 8:46 in the morning, the first plane had flown into the North Tower. So when I looked at the television at 9 o'clock in the morning, the North Tower was burning. And then I heard that a second plane had been hijacked and flown into the South Tower. And now, of course, everybody's saying terrorism. Even though I was off duty, I was going to get to the Trade Center because it was going to be such a mammoth event. I had just been at a major high-rise fire in a residential building a couple of weeks before. I had all this training and experience in high-rise fires. At that point, the city had pretty much shut down all the mass transit. There's no way really to get to headquarters fast, so I changed my plan and I decided I'm going to run to a nearby firehouse where I had worked. And when I got there, there were a bunch of other off-duty folks. And when we got to this particular firehouse, there was nobody there. And by nobody, I mean none of the on-duty people. They took the fire truck, they took all the equipment on the fire truck. The police were restricting entry into Manhattan. So the little group of us that was in the firehouse, the off-duty group, we decided we're going to go next door to the police precinct and we're going to ask them for a cop to drive us in a van over to the World Trade Center. When we get in the van, we're basically just wearing spare sets of gear, and off we head across the Brooklyn Bridge. As we're crossing the Brooklyn Bridge to get into Manhattan, of course, we're looking at this tremendous dust cloud in lower Manhattan and the smoke that's being generated by all the fires that are going on as a result of the collapse of the South Tower and the debris and everything that's falling off of the North Tower. On the other side of the bridge coming out towards Brooklyn, 4 lanes of people, many of them covered in dust. And what I remember about those people is that, nobody's pushing or shoving. I know that there had to have been injured people in that group. So everybody's just trying to get across to safety, and we're going into it. Just as we get to the Manhattan side of the Brooklyn Bridge, we hear a loud noise. And we hear, but we don't see the North Tower falling down. Now keep in mind, it took about 11 seconds for each of those 110-story buildings to fall down. And suddenly our little van is just in this tremendous cloud of dust, pulverized glass and concrete. The police officer couldn't see out of his windshield. He stops the van. We hop out. We immediately start coughing and rubbing our eyes because, of course, we don't have any breathing protection. And right near City Hall, where we had stopped, is a fire chief standing there on Broadway with a bunch of fire officers next to him. And he's all covered in dust because he's just survived the collapse of 2 110-story buildings. He seems to be handing out assignments to these fire officers. So I said, Chief, I have firefighters. He said, so he gives us an assignment. And we start to walk towards the Trade Center. It was very disorienting because nothing looked like it normally looked. I don't recognize the Trade Center. I don't recognize really the area, everything's on fire. All these buildings down there, they all had damage, and the sides facing the Trade Center were on fire. And then we're looking at 7 World Trade Center, 47 stories high, and it's still standing, but it's on fire from top to bottom. A decision had been made pretty early on in that they could not fight the fire in 7 World Trade Center, because when the Twin Towers fell down, they basically broke the water system around the Trade Center. And you also have to imagine, that what used to be 2 110-story buildings is now basically compressed into the 7 stories below ground and about 12 stories worth of debris above ground, and it's all on fire. A lot of people watched this on television. They may even have visited the World Trade Center at some point while the rescue and recovery effort was still going on, or they may have seen photographs or read books. But I'm telling you that that's nothing compared to being there that day. It was worse than their worst nightmare, worse than any science fiction movie or horror movie that you could possibly imagine. We thought we were going to die. Those of us who had any experience at all in our jobs, we knew this was way beyond impossible. And the best that we could hope for would be to try and rescue people who were trapped or who were injured. And so that's what we started to try and do. We were looking around the edges because it was so hot that it was impossible to really stand on the pile for any length of time. So as we're doing this, people keep coming up to us and saying, have you seen my fire company? Have you seen the people that I work with? Have you seen our fire truck? Have you seen my uncle? Have you seen my father? Have you seen my brother? And then as we're working at about 5:20 in the afternoon, when it's starting to get a little dark, we hear another noise. And this time it's 7 World Trade Center falling down. So everybody forgets that, 47-story building fell down in the late afternoon. But those of us who were in that particular spot don't forget, because once again, we were running down the street, running away from the dust cloud that's fallen down on top of us. All the stuff is enveloping us. You try not to think about the fact that you really think you're going to die here, that it's totally out of control. Any first responder who had any experience in their job that day, I think, wouldn't be telling the truth if they said they weren't scared. We were lucky. We just ran into a building and we got out of that. And once everything stopped and the debris cleared a little bit, we went out again and we started doing what we were doing again. The mentality of first responders is, we are here to help. No matter what you ask of us, we are going to try and help you in whatever way we can, even at risk to our own lives. That's what you sign up for when you take these jobs. But it's very frustrating as a first responder to feel like, I really want to help people here, but there's not a whole lot that can be done. We knew that, there were thousands, potentially tens of thousands of people who would need our help, including thousands of first responders who had come down there and were now trapped themselves. There were all these people there that needed our help. So, you weren't going to leave. You were going to do the best that you could. For me, I just feel incredibly lucky that I didn't die that day. I think for a lot of first responders down there, it was luck of the draw who lived and who died. 2 men that I knew, Pete Gansey and our first deputy fire commissioner, Bill Feehan, they were killed over on the West Side Highway when the North Tower fell down, and the firefighters and officer in Engine Company 3 were pretty much standing right next to Bill and Pete. And Engine 3 ran one way and Bill and Pete went the other way, and 3 survived Bill and Pete did not. Ladder 12, my own fire company, was in the Marriott Hotel helping to evacuate guests. And 3 of the company, the officer and 2 of the firefighters, were a little higher in the building and the stairs than the rest of the firefighters. So those 3 were killed, and the firefighters lower down survived. That's the way things went that day. It was just, which direction did you happen to run to? Where did you happen to be standing? So, somebody went back to the fire truck for a tool, that person survived, the rest of the people did not. As a first responder, you do not have total control over your environment. You try and mitigate risk when you're doing your job so that you're not wasting lives and you're not getting people injured unnecessarily. But at the same time, you realize that there are situations like 9/11 where you're going to be called to do things to try and help other people that aren't necessarily safe for you. So you have to make a decision about what's possible, what's the most effective thing that you can do to try and help. People were taking tremendous risks to try and find somebody alive. Crawling around looking for people who were trapped was kind of like working in a field of razor blades, because the concrete and the glass had been pulverized, but all the metal, the rebar, the sheet metal, the structural steel, that stuff was still around. So, as you're crawling around, I cut my arm open. People did not go on medical leave. They just got some first aid like I did. They patched me up, and you just keep working. Nobody should underestimate the demands that were being placed on first responders for not only on 9/11, but for weeks thereafter, and really for months after that. What's amazing to me is that nobody was killed after 9/11 because it was so incredibly dangerous down there. So on 9/11, at about midnight, after having been down there for more than 12 hours, I made a command decision. We need to go back to the firehouse. And that's when we found out that so many people were missing. And we wanted to try and find them as quickly as possible. There was only a certain time period that there would be any chance at all that they could still be alive. So early the next morning on September 12th, we left the firehouse and we went down to the Trade Center, and we were working and crawling around in this stuff and covered in things and moving debris and body parts and just searching for anything that might lead us to somebody that was trapped. We thought that we were going to find a lot of people, and actually there weren't a whole lot of people to be found. That was what was so kind of shocking about what was going on that day, was that there weren't more people that we saw to give aid to. But after a couple of weeks of that, the city basically decided that there wasn't anybody else to be found alive. That's when they brought in the heavy machinery to go right onto the site. And after that, the operation shifted to trying to find remains. Now, for months after 9/11, the fires were still burning. And so, we were still operating in a dangerous situation. We were still recovering remains 10 months after the event. I went down there in the month of April for the entire month to look for remains as an assignment. And we were still finding remains in April by smell. I'm not talking about the dogs. People could smell remains even 9 months later. What people often say that they remember is the smell of the Trade Center. That dust cloud went out 15 miles, and the stuff in the air hung around for months and months. Even people who weren't right on top of the World Trade Center still often have memories of what that area smelled like. One of the things that I think happens with a lot of people when they experience a traumatic event is that they do not talk about a lot of the details of the event to people who were not part of the event in the same way that they were. So what I was saying about my father not talking to the family about his experiences in World War II, but he would talk to other veterans who had similar combat experiences. It's often that way with the 9/11 community. I don't talk about a lot of things about 9/11 to people outside of, the folks that I was with that day or that I was around. So that 9/11 or a traumatic event doesn't define you, that you're not forever stuck in the trauma of that particular day. I think as a matter of like psychological recovery or survival, you don't constantly revisit those details in your mind. In my firehouse, we lost 5 guys. And then all around in my battalion, there were dozens of folks who were lost. And of the 343 in the fire department that I knew, I had worked with about 250 of them. So normally when there's a line of duty death, namely a firefighter or officer dies in the performance of their duties, there's a special unit that helps organize the funeral for that person. You'll have 5,000 firefighters, and then you'll have thousands of other first responders from all over the place come in for the funeral, and it's a big ceremony. And we would have, in the beginning, like a dozen funerals a day or a dozen memorials a day. So if you knew a lot of people on the job like I did, you had to make a decision whose funeral were you going to go to. And maybe you could get 3 funerals in a day, but invariably you'd have to miss somebody's funeral that you really wanted to be at. I think a lot of people had survivor guilt. There were a lot of people who were at the Trade Center who normally would have been off or in a different company, or, they just wouldn't have been there, but they were there. People who were scheduled to work and they traded a shift with somebody else, and now that person got killed and you didn't get killed. Now you're walking around, but the person who was there instead of you is not. Yamel Marino, who was this EMT who worked for a private ambulance company, she was killed helping somebody who was injured. Moira Smith, who was an NYPD officer, famously is photographed leading a bleeding man out of the South Tower, and then she went back in, and plenty of people testified about how Moira was directing them to get out of the building and get away from the area as quickly as possible, and she got trapped and died in the South Tower area. And then Kathy Mazza, who was helping people escape from the World Trade Center site when she herself was caught and killed in the collapse. So as a country, we owe it to these women to hear their stories and to preserve their stories. When people think about 9/11, they're invariably thinking about all the death and destruction, and that's never to be forgotten. But at the same time, I hope that people remember how that for a time at least, we pulled together and we tried to help out our neighbors and total strangers. And actually the whole world did that.